All right, so we are starting the third way on solving quadratic equations, and it's known as completing the square. Today we're going to start the basics of it, and then we'll pull it together and do the whole thing tomorrow. Now, with completing the square, there's a little bit of factoring that's involved, and there's a little bit of taking square roots that's involved, which is why we teach those two first, because we're going to pull those together to help us complete the square. Okay? So, in order to complete the square, we want to form perfect square trinomials. Now, we didn't specifically talk about these when we were factoring, but we did factor them. So we want to form perfect square trinomials. This was the type of problem where we had like x plus 2 squared. What does x plus 2 squared mean? It means x plus 2 times x plus 2. And then if I multiplied that out, and I'm just going to do it in my head, I would get x squared plus 4x plus 4. Okay? That's an example of a perfect square trinomial in its three different forms. So here's factored form. We can write it as 1 just squared because it's the same thing. And then here it is in standard form when we multiply it out. Okay, so we ultimately want to be able to form perfect square trinomials in order to complete the square. Now we have a little formula, I guess, that we use. So for complete the square, we are going to use b divided by 2 squared. And then we'll ultimately get something squared. Okay? So to complete the square, we're going to use b divided by 2 squared. You need to know that. I wouldn't call it a formula, but you need to know this. This is important. And like I said, we're doing one step today. We're going to keep it really basic today, and then we'll do the actual solving tomorrow. And this is ultimately going to be our C term. So we're solving for C. We're trying to figure out what I can plug in for C that makes my quadratic equation a perfect square. So let's look at x squared minus 8x plus blank. And that blank is our C, what we're going to fill in. If I had a value for C, what form is that in? What form is this? If, say there was a number here, what form is that? Standard form, where you should be able to identify your A, B, and C. Because for quadratic equations, remember we have ax squared plus bx plus c, so same as factoring. Right, this is standard form. So our A, B, and C are still the same thing. So in this particular problem, what is A? 1, because it's the number in front. What is B? And we don't know C at this time. That's what we're solving for. Okay. So in order to solve for C, I'm going to use this. I'm going to just call it a formula. B divided by 2 squared. So what is B again? Negative 8. So negative 8 divided by 2 squared is what? What's negative 8 divided by 2? Let's start there. Negative 4. And negative 4 squared is 16. So this blank is a 16. Okay, so that b divided by 2 squared gives me my C term. Now what I'm trying to create is a perfect square trinomial. So I have standard form right now. I want to factor it and see if I get the same thing factored. So how would I factor x squared minus 8x plus 16? the super x, right? So I know A is 1, C is now 16. Do you agree with that? Okay, so 1 times 16 is 16. B is negative 8. I have a 1x and a 1x. So I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to 16 and add to negative 8. Negative 4 and negative 4. Okay, I want to write a note. Our factors will always be the same. If you get something that's not the same, then you did the problem wrong. Your factors should always be the same. So in this case, I have a negative 4 and a negative 4. If I were to write that in factored form, I'd have x minus 4 times x minus 4, which I could write as x minus 4 squared. Now, again, tomorrow we're going to solve, but this is the first step. So your first thing is going to be to fill in C. The second thing you have to do is factor it to get a perfect square trinomial. That's all we're doing today. Okay? All right. Let's try another one together. So how about x squared plus 12x plus something? What is A? 1. What is B? And C is what we're trying to find. Whoops. C is what we're trying to find. So B divided by 2, so it's 12 divided by 2 squared. 12 divided by 2 is 6, and 6 squared is 36. So 36 goes in my blank, and 36 is my C. Okay. So step 1 is to fill in C, step 2 is to factor. So if I factor, I have A times C on top, so 36 on top, B on the bottom, a 1x and a 1x. So I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to 36 and add to 12. 6 and 6, right? They should be exactly the same. Because if they're not the same, you're doing something wrong. So x plus 6 times x plus 6, or x plus 6 squared. Now I want you to look at number 2. Do you notice anything that could save us a little bit of time? Does anyone see anything that could save us a little bit of time? Anything that kind of matches up? Elijah? You can what? I'm sorry? You can take out an X? No, because we don't know what C is. Brianna? Okay, so you're on the right track of what I want you to notice. But that's not quite it. No one sees anything else that could maybe save us a little bit of time? Okay, let's do the third one. Maybe you'll pick up on it. Okay, so I want you to try and see how far you get, and then I'm going to show you what I wanted you to notice. Okay, So go ahead and fill in the blank, and then I want you to write your perfect square trinomial. I did not record any of that. Okay. So that's all worked out. Take a look one more time before I'm going to have Connor tell you what he figured out. Take a look one more time and see if you can figure out something that's happening that could potentially save us some time. You know it? Some of you see it, maybe? Connor, what did you notice?
The negative 5 squared before you make the perfect x is going to be your factors.
So right before you square this to get your perfect square trinomial, that is always your factor. Right before I squared it, it's always my factor. Right before I squared it, it's always my factor. Do you see that? So this number here, right before you square it, will be your factor, which means you don't have to factor. You can go straight to this. The number right before you square it will be your factor. The number right before you square it will be your factor. Do you see that? And here's why that's helpful. Because we're going to get a problem that potentially looks like this. Yep. So x squared minus 15x plus blank. So we're going to start the same way. Okay. A is 1, B is negative 15, C we're looking for. And if we plug it into b divided by 2 squared, negative 15 divided by 2. What's negative 15 divided by 2? It's a decimal, which we're not allowed to have. So let's just square this. What's negative 15 squared? Negative 15 squared? But negative 15 squared would be a positive 225. And what's 2 squared? 4. So my C term is 225 over 4. Do you want to try to factor something like that? No. Probably not, right? But the number right before you square it is always your factor. So x minus 15 over 2 squared will be how I write it in factored form. Every single time, right? Negative 5, I would just bring it down here. 6, negative 4, because they're the same every single time. So we can go straight to filling in our C and then writing it in factored form without actually factoring. You see how we did that? Yeah? Okay, so try this one. So x squared minus 3x plus that blank. And then I want, not only should you fill in C, but you should write it in factored form. All right, so A is 1, B is negative 3, C we're trying to figure out. And it's b divided by 2 squared. Negative 3 divided by 2 gives me a decimal, so I'm going to leave it as is, and I'm going to square it. Now, every time we square it, whether this is positive or negative, our answer is always going to be positive for C, just as another FYI. Negative 3 squared is 9, and 2 squared is 4. So 9/4 goes there, but factored form is the number before I square it. So x minus 3/2 squared is what it should be in factored form. And again, oh, I did record at that time. Okay, so This starts our basics today. Eventually, well, tomorrow, we'll have an equal sign where we're going to have to solve, so we'll have another step. But if you can fill in C and you can get it in factored form, this part squared, the rest is taking square roots. Okay? Are we okay with that? All right.